In November of 1864, a team of Confederate agents checked into 19 different Manhattan hotels on the same night and set them all on fire, on orders from Richmond. The plan nearly worked. That story was buried for decades. In fact, it's one of 101. Most of them aren't in your history textbooks. Welcome to Sleepy American History. Let's get into it.
What if the bloodiest war in American history, a conflict that reshaped every institution, every dollar, and every definition of freedom in this country, started in part because of a rumor about shoes? What if the most famous speech of that war was called flat and forgettable by the morning papers? What if the last financial payment connected to that war was made not in the 1800s, not in the 1900s, but in the year 2020? Tonight, we're going through 101 secrets from the Civil War. The strange ones, the ironic ones, the quietly human ones that got buried under the bigger story. Get comfortable. Dim the lights if they aren't already. This is history told slowly, the way it was always meant to be heard. In the dark, just before sleep. 1. Confederate agents tried to burn down New York City in a single night. There's something about November that already feels tense. The days shorter, the air colder, the sense that something is coiling just beneath the surface. On the night of November 19th, 1864, something almost catastrophic unfolded across Manhattan. A team of Confederate agents had checked into 19 different hotels simultaneously, each carrying containers of a highly flammable compound called Greek fire. Their orders, originating from Confederate leadership in Canada, were simple and staggering. Burn the city down in one coordinated strike. The fires were set. Smoke rose from multiple locations across the island. And yet, New York survived because the incendiary formula the agents used was poorly prepared and failed to sustain the flames. Had the compound been more effective, the financial heart of the Northern War effort might have turned to ash. Almost nobody learns this story in school, which feels like its own kind of secret worth keeping your eyes open for, at least a little longer. If this is the kind of history that makes you want to stay just a bit more awake, go ahead and subscribe. There are 100 more secrets exactly like this one waiting for you. 2. The submarine that vanished after making history. Some stories disappear right along with the thing they're about, and this is one of them. On February 17th, 1864, a Confederate submarine called the H.L. Hunley slipped through the dark waters off Charleston, South Carolina, and did something no underwater vessel had ever done before. It sank an enemy warship. The target was the USS Housatonic, a Union sloop of war, and the Hunley struck it with a torpedo mounted on a long pole at the bow. The Housatonic went down. And then here's the thing. The Hunley simply vanished. No wreckage found, no survivors, no explanation. For 131 years, the submarine lay somewhere on the ocean floor, completely lost. It was finally located in 1995 and raised in the year 2000. When researchers examined the interior, they found the crew still positioned at their stations, as though time had simply paused. What sank the Hunley remains an open question to this day. Some mysteries, it turns out, survive even being found. 3. One night, 3 targets. One plot to hollow out the government. Most people know that Abraham Lincoln was shot at Ford's Theater on the night of April 14th, 1865. Fewer people know that his assassination was only one part of a coordinated plan designed to strike 3 targets in a single evening. While John Wilkes Booth carried out his attack at the theater, a co-conspirator named Lewis Powell forced his way into the home of Secretary of State William Seward and attacked him with a knife. Seward survived, though he carried the physical effects of that night for the rest of his life. A third conspirator, George Atzerodt, riots had been assigned to kill Vice President Andrew Johnson at his hotel. Here's the thing about Azeroth. He lost his nerve entirely, spent the evening at a hotel bar, and never went through with it. Had all three attacks succeeded, the United States would have had no president, no vice president, and no secretary of state simultaneously. The country came closer to that outcome than most history books tend to linger on. 4. The President of the Confederacy and the coat that started a rumor. By May of 1865, the war was over in every practical sense, but Jefferson Davis, President of the Confederacy, was still attempting to flee. Union cavalry closed in on his camp in Georgia, and in the urgent confusion of that morning, his wife, Verena, threw one of her coats over his shoulders to protect him from the cold and help conceal him. It didn't work. Davis was captured within moments. So, here's the thing about what happened next. Northern newspapers ran with the story and illustrated it enthusiastically, depicting Davis as having dressed in women's clothing in a deliberate attempt at disguise. The cartoon spread widely, and the mockery followed him for years. Davis maintained until the end of his life that the garment was simply a raglan-style overcoat that happened to belong to his wife. His wife's own account, recorded separately, described the moment differently. 2 people, and 1 coat, and a story that neither version ever fully settled, which is, in its own way, a very human ending to a very large war. 5. The spy who carried secrets in her hair, Washington society in the early 1860s, was full of dinner parties, and Rose O'Neal Greenhow attended nearly all of them. She was charming, well-connected, and deeply embedded in the social circles that included Union senators, generals, and government officials. She was also, throughout this entire period, one of the Confederacy's most effective intelligence sources. Here's the thing about how she passed information. She used coded messages concealed in her hair and in the clothing of trusted couriers. The intelligence she gathered is believed to have contributed to the Confederate victory at the First Battle of Bull Run in 1861. She was eventually arrested and, remarkably, continued her work from inside a Washington prison. Released and exiled, she traveled to Europe to build support for the Confederate cause. She never stopped. In 1864, returning by ship from Europe, her blockade runner capsized near the North Carolina coast. She was found in the water carrying $2,000 in Confederate gold. The weight of it, historians note, pulled her under. Even her ending carried a kind of hidden weight. 6. The last Confederate general nobody talks about. When people think about the end of the Civil War, they think of Appomattox, Robert E. Lee, a quiet courthouse, April 9th, 1865, and that's where most tellings of the story stop. But here's the thing, the war didn't end on the same day for everyone. Stand Watie, a Cherokee leader who had risen to the rank of brigadier general in the Confederate Army, didn't surrender until June 23, 1865, 75 days after Lee laid down his arms. He was the last Confederate general to formally surrender. Watie's story is part of a much larger, much less commonly taught chapter of the war. Thousands of Native Americans served on both sides of the conflict, their participation shaped by treaty obligations, political alliances, and the complex geography of Indian Territory. The 5 civilized tribes were divided, communities split, and the consequences of the war fell on them with particular weight in the years that followed. Stand Watie stands at the end of the war like a footnote that was never quite given enough room on the page. 7. The bloodiest battle in American history began over shoes. There are moments in history where an enormous thing turns on something surprisingly small, and the Battle of Gettysburg is one of the clearest examples. In the summer of 1863, Confederate soldiers in General A.P. Hill's corps were in poor condition, undersupplied, worn down, and in many cases marching without adequate footwear. Word reached them that the town of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, might have a supply of shoes. That was enough. On July 1st, 1863, Confederate forces moved toward the town to investigate the rumor. They encountered Union cavalry. Within hours, reinforcements were pouring in from both sides. Within 2 days, 165,000 soldiers were engaged across the surrounding fields and ridgelines. By the time it ended, roughly 51,000 men had been killed, wounded, or gone missing, making Gettysburg the single bloodiest battle ever fought on American soil. Here's the thing about that. None of it was planned in advance. The largest battle of the Civil War assembled itself around a rumor about footwear, almost by accident. 8. One day that surpassed every other day of loss. September 17th, 1862, began before dawn along Antietam Creek in western Maryland. By the time darkness fell, 22,717 American soldiers had been killed, wounded, or reported missing, all in the span of a single day. No day in any American war, before or since, has produced a casualty count like that one. To put it alongside something more familiar, the Allied landings at Normandy on D-Day in 1944 resulted in roughly 10,000 casualties. The fighting at Iwo Jima across the entire 5-week battle produced comparable numbers. Antietam produced its toll between sunrise and sunset on one September afternoon. Here's the thing that makes it even harder to absorb. The battle ended without a decisive result. Neither side destroyed the other. Lee's army withdrew across the Potomac the following night, battered but intact. The Union held the field, and the most costly day in American military history concluded with the war still very much ongoing. Some days in history carry more weight than their hours should allow. 9. 21 men crossed into Vermont from Canada. For most of the war, Vermonters watched the conflict from a comfortable distance, geographically speaking at least. The fighting was far to the south, and the Canadian border to the north was quiet. Then, on the morning of October 19, 1864, 21 Confederate soldiers crossed that border and rode into the small town of St. Albans, Vermont. They robbed 3 banks in rapid succession, taking roughly $200,000, then attempted to set fire to buildings before retreating back across the Canadian border. It was the northernmost land raid of the entire Civil War. The men were briefly apprehended by Canadian authorities, but here's the thing. They were released. Canadian courts ruled that the raid had been a legitimate act of war rather than common robbery. The episode nearly caused a serious diplomatic crisis between the United States and Britain, which still governed Canada at the time. The money was largely recovered. The soldiers were never tried. And St. Albans holds the quiet distinction of being the only town in New England where the Civil War physically arrived. 10. One night on the Combahee River. On the night of June 2nd, 1863, Harriet Tubman did something that no woman in American military history had done before or has done since. She guided Colonel James Montgomery and 150 black Union soldiers up the Combahee River in South Carolina in a coordinated military operation. Tubman had spent weeks gathering intelligence from local contacts, mapping Confederate positions and the locations of underwater torpedoes along the river. The raid moved swiftly. Confederate infrastructure along the river was destroyed, and 727 enslaved people were brought to freedom in a single night, the largest single liberation action of the entire war. Here's the thing about how Tubman is sometimes described in relation to this event. History textbooks were slow to frame her role accurately. She didn't assist the raid, she planned it. The intelligence work, the route, the timing, all of it came from her preparation. Decades later, historians in the government formally recognized her military service and the singular nature of what she accomplished on that river in the dark before most of the country was even awake. 11. The army that watched the war from the sky. Imagine standing in a field in Virginia in 1861, looking up and seeing a large silk balloon drifting overhead, connected to the ground by a thin cable, with a man inside transmitting military intelligence in real time via telegraph. This was not a dream. This was Thaddeus Lowe's U.S. Army Balloon Corps, the first aerial reconnaissance program in American military history. Lowe and his team operated from 1861 to 1863, ascending to altitudes above 1,000 feet and reporting Confederate troop movements to Union commanders on the ground below. President Lincoln personally observed a demonstration and authorized the program. Here's the thing about how the Confederacy responded. They sent sharpshooters specifically tasked with shooting the balloons down. They also attempted to build their own observation balloons using silk dress fabric when military supplies proved unavailable. The Balloon Corps was eventually disbanded due to bureaucratic disputes rather than enemy action. But for 2 years, the sky above the Virginia battlefields was occupied, and the future of military surveillance had already begun its long ascent. 12. The night the wounded glowed blue. After the Battle of Shiloh, in April of 1862, thousands of soldiers lay in muddy fields through a cold, wet night, waiting for medical care that was slow to arrive. Some of those soldiers noticed something that seemed impossible: a faint blue-green light emanating from their own wounds. Officers who heard about it dismissed the reports. The soldiers who experienced it remembered it for the rest of their lives. Here's the thing that took more than a century to explain. In 2001, 2 high school students researching this phenomenon for a science fair identified the likely cause. The cold, wet soil of the battlefield contained a bioluminescent bacterium called Photohabdus luminescens. Under the right conditions, this organism glows, and it also happens to produce natural antibiotic compounds. Soldiers whose wounds contained this bacterium were, by some accounts, more likely to survive. The phenomenon came to be called Angel's Glow, a battlefield full of suffering produced entirely by accident, something that looked almost like comfort. Small lights in the dark, doing quiet, unintentional good. 13. A perfect plan that succeeded too well. By the summer of 1864, the siege of Petersburg, Virginia, had settled into a grinding stalemate. A regiment of Pennsylvania coal miners had an idea. They proposed tunneling beneath Confederate lines, packing the tunnel with gunpowder, and blowing a gap wide enough for Union troops to pour through. The Army approved it. For a month, the miners dug 500 feet of tunnel, completed in extraordinary secrecy. On July the 30th, 8,000 pounds of gunpowder detonated beneath the Confederate trenches and created a crater 170 feet long and 30 feet deep. The explosion worked exactly as planned. Here's the thing about what happened next. Union soldiers, rather than advancing around the crater, charged directly into it. The steep walls made climbing out nearly impossible. Confederate forces recovered quickly and positioned themselves at the rim. The men below were trapped. 4,000 Union casualties resulted from a battle that should have been a decisive breakthrough. It remains one of the most studied examples in military history of a plan succeeding and a moment still being lost. 14. A doctor, a ship, and a plan. That science made impossible. Luke Blackburn was a respected physician from Kentucky who, during the Civil War, traveled to Bermuda under the cover of humanitarian work. While there, he quietly collected clothing and personal items that had belonged to yellow fever victims, packed them into trunks, and arranged for those trunks to be shipped to cities across the North. His intent was to trigger epidemic outbreaks that would weaken the Union's civilian population and overwhelm its cities. One shipment was reportedly directed toward Washington itself. Here's the thing that Blackburn didn't know, and that medical science of the era hadn't yet established. Yellow fever is not transmitted through clothing or contaminated objects. It spreads through the bite of infected mosquitoes. So, the plan was entirely ineffective by the laws of biology. Blackburn was later arrested and tried, but was acquitted in Canadian courts. He eventually returned to Kentucky, where he later served as governor. The intent behind his wartime actions was documented, investigated, and remembered, even as the scientific reality made the outcome far less dire than he had planned. 15. The war that swallowed. Every other war numbers have a way of becoming abstract when they get large enough. So consider this one slowly. Historians estimate that between 620,000 and 850,000 soldiers died in the Civil War from battle, disease, and the hardships of camp life over 4 years of conflict. For most of the 20th century, that single war's death toll exceeded the combined military deaths of every other American conflict up to that point. The Revolutionary War, the War of 1812, the Mexican-American War, the Spanish-American War, both World Wars, Korea, and Vietnam, added together. One war, 4 years. More American lives than all the others combined. Here's the thing that makes that number feel different when you sit with it. These were not foreign wars fought on distant soil. This was Americans fighting Americans on American ground in American towns. The Civil War didn't happen somewhere else. It happened here in fields that still exist, along rivers that still run, in places that still carry the weight of those 4 years in ways that haven't entirely faded. 20 chapters feels like a long way, but you've only come 15. Take a slow breath. Let your shoulders drop. The history isn't going anywhere, and neither are you. Just settle in a little more, and we'll keep going gently from here. 16. The tax that forgot to leave Congress has passed many laws described as temporary. Here's the thing about the word temporary in legislative history. It rarely means what it sounds like. In 1861, facing the staggering cost of mobilizing an army from nearly nothing, Congress passed the Revenue Act, which created the first federal income tax in American history. The rate was 3% on annual incomes above $800. Lawmakers were clear. This was a wartime measure, a financial emergency tool that would expire when the emergency ended. The war ended in 1865. The income tax was repealed in 1872. But the concept had been introduced, the infrastructure had been built, and the appetite for federal revenue had grown. The 16th Amendment, ratified in 1913, made the federal income tax a permanent feature of American life. The tax that Congress created to fight the Civil War became, in a different form, one of the most enduring institutions of the modern American government. Temporary. It turned out was always a relative term. Some wartime measures simply stay for dinner and never quite leave. 17. The name that came from a clerical error. Hiram Ulysses Grant was born in Point Pleasant, Ohio in 1822. He grew up as Hiram, went by his middle name Ulysses among family and friends, and was perfectly accustomed to his initials spelling H-U-G, which is, for a future military commander, a somewhat disarming set of letters. When a congressman arranged Grant's appointment to West Point, he made an error on the paperwork, listing the young man as Ulysses S. Grant, borrowing the S from his mother's maiden name, Simpson, without anyone asking. Grant arrived at the academy and discovered he had a new name. Here's the thing about what he did next. He kept it. Partly because West Point had already registered him, partly because correcting bureaucratic paperwork in 1839 was not a simple process, and partly by some accounts, because he genuinely preferred the new arrangement. The S officially stands for nothing. It never did. But Ulysses S. Grant went on to command the Union Army, win the Civil War, and serve 2 terms as president, all under a name that began with someone else's mistake. 18. The general who was shot by his own side. Thomas Jonathan Jackson had earned the nickname Stonewall at the First Battle of Bull Run, and by the spring of 1863, he was considered one of the most brilliant military minds in the Confederacy. On the evening of May 2nd, returning from a reconnaissance mission in the gathering dark near Chancellorsville, Virginia, his party was mistaken for advancing Union cavalry by Confederate sentries. Shots were fired before anyone could call out a correction. Jackson was struck 3 times. His left arm was amputated the following day. Robert E. Lee, upon hearing the news, reportedly said that Jackson had lost his left arm, but that he himself had lost his right. Jackson developed pneumonia in the days that followed and died on May 10, 1863. Here's the thing about the strategic consequences. Many historians argue that the Confederacy never fully recovered from the loss. Jackson's particular gift for rapid, unexpected movement had been central to Confederate victories across 2 years of war. What replaced him at the command level was capable, but different. And the difference, some argue, showed most clearly 2 months later at a small Pennsylvania town called Gettysburg. 19. The youngest sergeant in U.S. Army history, Johnny Clem, was 9 years old when he first tried to enlist. The Army said no, which was a reasonable response to a 9-year-old presenting himself at a recruiting office. Clem was not discouraged. He attached himself informally to the 22nd Michigan Infantry as a drummer boy and mascot, with soldiers in the regiment pooling together a modest wage to support him. He marched with them. He learned. He stayed. At the Battle of Chickamauga in September of 1863, Clem was 12 years old. During the fighting, he picked up a rifle and, according to military accounts, used it to defend himself when a Confederate officer demanded his surrender. The account made its way up the chain of command. Clem was promoted to sergeant, the youngest non-commissioned officer in U.S. Army history. Here's the thing about how his story continued. He stayed in the military. He served for decades. He was eventually commissioned as an officer and retired in 1915 as a major general, having spent more than 50 years in uniform. He first showed up uninvited at age 9, and the Army never quite got around to sending him home. 20. Equal work, unequal pay. When the United States colored troops were organized beginning in 1862 and formally expanded through 1863, approximately 180,000 black men ultimately served in the Union Army across more than 400 engagements. They fought at Port Hudson, at Fort Wagner, along the Red River, and in the final campaigns that ended the war. Here's the thing that ran alongside all of it. For much of the war, they were paid less. White Union soldiers received $13 a month. Black soldiers received $10, with $3 additional deducted for clothing, making the real gap considerably wider. Many soldiers and their families wrote letters of protest. Some regiments refused to accept any pay at all until the inequality was corrected, rather than be compensated under terms they considered unjust. Congress amended the Enrollment Act in 1864 to equalize pay, and some soldiers received back pay. The men who served knew what they were fighting for. They made that clear not only on the battlefield, but in the quiet, principled act of refusing a paycheck that said they were worth less. You've made it through 20 of these, which means a fifth of the journey is already behind you. If your eyes are getting heavy, that's exactly right. Let the words wash over you. The history keeps going whether you're fully awake or not. And there's something peaceful about knowing the story will still be here when you drift back in. 21. The spy who worked in plain sight. Elizabeth Van Lew was one of Richmond's most prominent citizens, educated, wealthy, and openly sympathetic to the Union cause. Most of her neighbors assumed she was simply eccentric. They called her Crazy Bet and largely left her alone. That, it turned out, was exactly the cover she needed. Van Lew spent the entire war running the most effective Union intelligence network, operating inside the Confederacy. She recruited agents, passed coded messages, and helped Union prisoners escape from Richmond's Libby prison. Here's the thing that makes her story even more remarkable. She placed a formerly enslaved woman named Mary Bowser directly inside Jefferson Davis's household, where Bowser gathered intelligence and passed it back through Van Loo's network. Setu Grant later credited Van Loo's operation as one of his most valuable information sources during the final campaigns. After the war, he personally appointed her postmistress of Richmond. She had spent 4 years hiding in full view, and she'd done it extraordinarily well. 22. The spy master who kept getting the numbers wrong. Alan Pinkerton had built a famous detective agency before the war, so when Lincoln needed someone to run military intelligence, Pinkerton seemed like a natural choice. He was organized, energetic, and completely dedicated to his work. Here's the thing about that work, though. He was consistently, significantly wrong about Confederate troop strength. Pinkerton's reports repeatedly estimated Confederate forces at roughly double their actual numbers. General George McClellan, who commanded the Army of the Potomac, relied heavily on those reports. When Pinkerton told him the enemy was too strong to engage, McClellan believed it. The Army of the Potomac held back, sometimes for weeks, when it held decisive advantages on the field. Military historians have studied these reports carefully and concluded that Pinkerton's inflated estimates contributed meaningfully to missed Union opportunities during the Peninsula Campaign of 1862. Pinkerton was loyal, capable in many respects, and genuinely believed his assessments. Good intentions and bad intelligence, it turns out, can be just as costly as anything else on a battlefield. 23. Fort Pillow and the congressional investigation that followed. April 12, 1864, began with a Confederate assault on Fort Pillow, Tennessee, a Union-held position on the Mississippi River, garrisoned by both white and black soldiers. Confederate forces under General Nathan Bedford Forrest captured the fort after several hours of fighting. What happened after the garrison surrendered became one of the most investigated and debated events of the entire war. Congressional committees gathered witness testimony from survivors indicating that a significant number of black Union soldiers, approximately 300 men, were killed after the surrender rather than taken as prisoners. The Confederate government denied that any wrongdoing had occurred. Congress launched a formal investigation, collected extensive testimony, and published its findings. Here's the thing about those findings. They were unambiguous in their conclusions. The report documented the events in considerable detail. Forrest went on to play a significant role in post-war Southern history as well, a legacy that historians continue to examine carefully. The story of Fort Pillow became one of the war's most sobering chapters. 24. The speech everyone got wrong the next morning. November 19th, 1863. The dedication of the Soldiers' National Cemetery at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. The featured speaker that afternoon was Edward Everett, a former senator and one of the most celebrated orators in the country. He spoke for 2 hours. Then Abraham Lincoln stood and delivered 272 words in roughly 2 minutes. The crowd response was polite but muted. The speech was over almost before people realized it had begun. Here's the thing about what appeared in the papers the next morning. Several prominent publications were not kind. One Chicago paper described the remarks as flat and unsuitable for the occasion. Lincoln himself reportedly expressed doubt about how the words had landed. Edward Everett, however, wrote Lincoln a gracious letter the following day, saying he wished he had come as close to the heart of the occasion in 2 hours as Lincoln had in 2 minutes. History eventually agreed with Everett. The speech the press dismissed is now carved in stone in Washington. 25. The $300 question. When Congress passed the Enrollment Act in 1863, establishing the first federal military draft in American history, it included a provision that generated immediate and fierce controversy. Any man whose name was drawn in the draft could pay a commutation fee of $300 to be exempted from that particular draft round. $300 was roughly equivalent to a year's wages for an average laborer. Wealthier men could also hire a substitute to serve indefinitely in their place. Here's the thing about how people responded. The phrase rich man's war, poor man's fight spread quickly through working class communities in the North. In New York City, that anger boiled over in July of 1863 into 4 days of serious civil unrest, the deadliest in American history, resulting in at least 119 deaths. The commutation provision was eventually repealed. The substitution system remained. The tension between shared sacrifice and unequal burden is one the Civil War never quite managed to resolve, and the draft riots are its most visible expression. 26. The general who said no twice. In April of 1861, as Virginia moved toward secession, Francis Preston Blair Sr. met with Robert E. Lee at Blair House in Washington, across the street from the White House. Blair, acting with Lincoln's knowledge, offered Lee field command of the Union Army then being organized. Lee was a decorated officer with decades of distinguished service, including a celebrated record in the Mexican-American War. He listened. He declined. Lee then went to see General-in-Chief Winfield Scott and submitted his resignation from the U.S. Army. Here's the thing Lee said in a letter to his sister around that time. He described the decision as agonizing and said he could not bring himself to take up arms against his home state of Virginia, even though he personally opposed both secession and war. He accepted command of Virginia's military forces days later. The man Lincoln wanted to lead the Union Army spent the next 4 years leading the army against it. History has few cleaner examples of how deeply loyalty to place could cut, even against a person's stated beliefs. 27. Sherman's March and its contradictions. William Tecumseh Sherman is remembered for one of the most consequential military campaigns of the Civil War. His march to the sea through Georgia in the autumn of 1864. Sherman's strategy was deliberate. Destroy the Confederate infrastructure of roads, rail lines, and supplies to make continued resistance unsustainable. It worked. He accepted the largest Confederate surrender of any Union general. Here's the thing that history asks us to hold alongside that record. Sherman's personal views on race were complicated and, at times, hostile, despite his service to the Union cause. During the march, his army was followed by tens of thousands of formerly enslaved people seeking freedom. Sherman took steps to limit how many could follow his columns, citing supply concerns. A later policy called Special Field Orders Number, R-15, the source of the phrase 40 acres and a mule, was issued under Sherman's command but rescinded after the war. Sherman's campaign helped end the war. What he believed and how he acted was more complicated than the outcome suggests. 28. The afternoon that made wooden ships obsolete. On the morning of March 9th, 1862, 2 iron-hulled warships met in the waters of Hampton Roads, Virginia, and spent 4 hours trying to damage each other. Neither succeeded in sinking the other. The battle ended without a decisive result. By any ordinary measure, it was a tactical draw. Here's the thing about what it actually was. It was the end of the wooden warship as a serious instrument of naval warfare. The USS Monitor, a Union ironclad with a rotating gun turret, and the CSS Virginia, a Confederate ironclad rebuilt on the hull of a captured Union frigate, demonstrated that iron plating changed every calculation a navy had to make. Every major naval power in the world was watching. Britain, which had the largest fleet on Earth, began the process of converting its vessels within weeks. The ships of the line that had defined naval combat for centuries were suddenly museum pieces. 4 hours of inconclusive fighting rewrote every navy's future in an afternoon. 29. The army held in place by painted logs. During the Peninsula Campaign of 1862, Confederate General Joseph Johnston needed to buy time. His forces weren't strong enough to hold their positions at Centerville, Virginia, against the massive Union army gathering to the east. So his troops did something that, in retrospect, is either clever or almost absurdly simple. They fashioned logs into shapes that resembled artillery barrels, painted them black, and positioned them facing the Union lines. These decoys became known as Quaker guns, a reference to the Quaker tradition of peaceful non-resistance. From a distance, they looked exactly like cannon. Here's the thing about the army that faced them. General George McClellan's force of over 100,000 men held its position for weeks, influenced partly by intelligence, suggesting Confederate defenses were far stronger than they were. When Union scouts finally advanced and discovered the ruse, the Confederates had already completed their withdrawal. The painted logs had accomplished what actual artillery might not have. Sometimes the most effective weapon is the one that never fires. 30. A mile of open ground, July the 3rd, 1863. The third and final day at Gettysburg, Confederate General Robert E. Lee ordered an assault on the center of the Union line on Cemetery Ridge, a charge across nearly a mile of open farmland, uphill, against entrenched positions with clear fields of fire. Approximately 12,500 Confederate soldiers stepped out of the tree line and began walking. Here's the thing that makes this moment so studied, so debated, and so quietly heartbreaking. The men who walked across that field were experienced, disciplined soldiers following orders they had received, and in many cases, questioned. Over 6,500 of them became casualties in under an hour. Every field officer in one Virginia regiment was killed or wounded. The charge reached the Union line briefly at one point, a place later called the high water mark of the Confederacy, before being pushed back. General Pickett, who led the assault, was asked after the war why his charge had failed. He reportedly answered that he thought the Union Army had something to do with it. 31. The agency born on the wrong day, April 14th, 1865, was an unusually full day for Abraham Lincoln. He attended a cabinet meeting that morning, dealt with correspondence, made appointments, and discussed the work of rebuilding the country now that the war was drawing to a close. At some point that day, he signed legislation establishing the United States Secret Service. The agency's original mandate had nothing to do with protecting the president. It was created specifically to combat the massive counterfeiting problem that had emerged during the war, with an estimated 1/3 of all currency in circulation being fake. Here's the thing about the timing that history has never quite gotten over. That same evening, Lincoln attended a performance at Ford's Theater and was fatally shot. The Secret Service was founded the day its first potential protectee was killed. It didn't formally take on presidential protection as a responsibility until after President William McKinley was assassinated in 1901, 36 years later. So, the agency created on that April day spent nearly 4 decades before anyone gave it the job it's now most known for. 32. The legal right Lincoln set aside. Habeas corpus is one of the oldest legal protections in the English-speaking world. The right of a person who has been imprisoned to appear before a court and challenge the legality of their detention. It has been a cornerstone of civil liberty for centuries. In 1861, Abraham Lincoln suspended it. He authorized military commanders to arrest and hold civilians suspected of Confederate sympathies without formal charges or trial. Chief Justice Roger Taney issued a ruling declaring Lincoln's action unconstitutional and beyond the authority of the executive branch. Here's the thing Lincoln did with that ruling. He ignored it. He did not formally respond to it. He simply continued the policy. Over 14,000 civilians were imprisoned without trial during the war. Lincoln maintained that the emergency conditions of active rebellion left him no practical alternative. Legal scholars have debated his reasoning ever since. The tension between civil liberty and national security that Lincoln navigated in 1861 has never fully resolved itself, and his decisions remain among the most discussed of his presidency. 33. The teenage spy who became an actress. Belle Boyd was 17 years old in the summer of 1861 when a confrontation at her family's home in Martinsburg, Virginia, led to a shooting incident that was later ruled justified by Union investigators. Rather than stepping away from the conflict, Boyd moved toward it. She began collecting information from Union soldiers passing through the area and passing it along to Confederate commanders. She was, by any measure, bold. On one occasion, she reportedly ran across an open field under fire to deliver intelligence directly to Stonewall Jackson's advancing forces. She was arrested 6 times over the course of the war and imprisoned twice. Here's the thing about what happened after. She was eventually exiled to Europe, where she continued working on behalf of the Confederacy until the war ended. After the war, she built an entirely new career, touring the United States and Britain as a stage actress and lecturer, performing dramatic accounts of her wartime experiences. She was, in the end, a very good storyteller. She had the material for it. 34. Where Memorial Day began, in the spring of 1865, in the city of Charleston, South Carolina, something quiet and deliberate took place that historians have more recently identified as one of the earliest origins of what became Memorial Day. Tree, a former Confederate horse racing track, had been used as a prison camp during the war, and within its grounds were buried 257 Union soldiers who had died there. A group of freed black residents of Charleston, many of them formerly enslaved, organized to give those soldiers a proper burial. They moved the remains, built a proper fence around the site, and on May 1st, 1865, gathered for a ceremony of remembrance that included a parade and a service. Here's the thing about this moment. It largely disappeared from the official story of how Memorial Day was created for many decades afterward. Historians, including David Blight, have documented the Charleston ceremony carefully and argued it represents the earliest large organized Decoration Day event. The people who held it wanted to say, "Thank you." That part, at least, was never in question. 35. The colony that never came home. When the war ended in 1865, most Confederate soldiers made their way back to their farms and towns and tried to rebuild their lives under the changed conditions of a reunified country. Some did not. Approximately 10,000 Confederates chose instead to leave the United States entirely, emigrating to Brazil over the decade that followed. Brazil, at the time, still permitted slavery, a fact that was part of the appeal for those who refused to accept the outcome of the war. They settled in a region they named Americana, in the state of São Paulo, and built communities that maintained Southern American customs, food traditions, and cultural practices. Here's the thing that makes this story feel particularly long. Their descendants still live there. Communities in Brazil, identifying as Confederados, continue to hold annual festivals that celebrate their heritage, drawing both local residents and researchers from the United States. The Civil War's reach extended south of the equator, and in a small corner of Brazil, it has never entirely ended. 36. Both armies, same playbook. Here's something that takes a moment to fully absorb. When the Civil War began, soldiers on both sides of the conflict were trained using many of the same military manuals. One of the most widely used was a drill and tactics guide written by William Hardy, a U.S. Army officer who became a Confederate general. Hardy's Rifle and Light Infantry Tactics was the standard training manual for the pre-war U.S. Army, and it remained in use by Union forces after the war began, even as Hardy himself fought for the other side. Henry Halleck's writing on military strategy was similarly read on both sides. Here's the thing about what that meant practically. Officers who had trained together at West Point, who had studied the same texts and drilled on the same principles, were now applying that shared knowledge against each other. Many of them knew personally the men commanding the forces facing them. The Civil War was, among many other things, a war in which both sides frequently understood exactly what the other was likely to do next. 37. The Constitution that borrowed from itself. When Confederate leaders drafted their new Constitution in 1861, they didn't start from scratch. The Confederate Constitution was modeled closely on the U.S. Constitution, borrowing its structure, much of its language, and large portions of its text, almost word for word. But the changes were deliberate and revealing. The Confederate Constitution explicitly named and protected slavery throughout its text. It gave the president a line-item veto over spending bills. It limited the president to a single term of 6 years. It prohibited protective tariffs that favored domestic industry. Here's the thing that historians find particularly worth noting. The Confederate government, which was founded on the principle of strong states' rights and resistance to centralized federal power, rapidly became quite centralized itself as the practical demands of fighting a major war made decentralization impossible. Confederate governors clashed repeatedly with the Richmond government over control of troops and resources. The document they wrote to limit central authority couldn't prevent them from needing it. That particular gap between political philosophy and wartime reality followed the Confederacy throughout its existence. 38. The prison that became a warning camp. Sumter, located near Andersonville, Georgia, operated for only 14 months. In that time, it held approximately 45,000 Union prisoners under conditions that became among the most documented humanitarian disasters of the Civil War era. At its most crowded point, 33,000 men were confined in a space originally intended for 10,000. Shelter, clean water, and adequate food were chronically insufficient. 13,000 men died there from disease, malnutrition, and exposure. Here's the thing about what happened after the war. The camp's commander, Captain Henry Wirtz, was tried before a military tribunal and executed in November of 1865. The only Confederate official put to death for war crimes following the conflict. His trial was contested at the time and has been debated by historians since, with questions about individual versus systemic responsibility. The site of Andersonville is now a National Historic Site and a National Prisoner of War Museum. It was preserved not as a celebration of anything, but as a place that should not be forgotten. 39. Paper money and the war. That made it before the Civil War, the United States did not have a single national currency. Money was issued by hundreds of individual state-chartered banks, backed in theory by gold reserves, and varying wildly in value and reliability depending on which bank had printed it. The system worked imperfectly in peacetime. When the war began and expenses immediately overwhelmed available gold reserves, it collapsed. In 1862, Congress passed the Legal Tender Act, authorizing the Treasury to issue paper currency backed not by gold, but by the credit of the federal government. These notes were printed with green ink on the back and quickly became known as greenbacks. Here's the thing about how people felt about them. Skepticism was widespread and reasonable. Paper money with no metal backing was genuinely new and genuinely uncertain. The greenback lost value, recovered, chart, and created decades of monetary and political conflict that echoed through the rest of the 19th century. The currency in your pocket today descends in a direct institutional line from an emergency decision made in the middle of a war. 40. The bullet that traveled the wrong way. Chancellorsville, Virginia, May of 1863. In the chaos of a major battle, Corporal James C. Parrott of the 7th West Virginia Infantry was struck by a bullet that entered through his forehead. By any reasonable expectation, this should have been immediately fatal. Instead, the bullet traveled along the inside of his skull and came to rest in the back of his neck, where surgeons were eventually able to locate and remove it. Here's the thing about what happened after. Parrott survived. He recovered, returned to his life, and lived for another 47 years, dying in 1910. He kept the bullet. At veterans' reunions in the years that followed, he was known to show it to people, a small piece of metal that had taken a remarkable path through a remarkable life. His case was documented by military surgeons and entered the historical record of Civil War medicine. The war produced a great many extraordinary medical cases, partly because the scale of the conflict gave surgeons more experience more quickly than any previous war in American history had. 41. The 20 hours at the bloody angle. There are battles within battles, so smaller, more concentrated struggles that somehow contain the whole weight of a war in a very small space. The bloody angle at Spotsylvania Courthouse on May 12, 1864, was one of those. Union and Confederate soldiers fought across a log breastwork, a low defensive wall, for nearly 20 consecutive hours, through rain and darkness, at extremely close range. The fighting was sustained and exhausting in a way that left witnesses struggling to describe it afterward. So, here's the thing that gives a sense of its intensity. Rifle fire was so continuous that oak trees several feet in diameter were eventually cut down entirely by bullets alone. Not artillery, just rifle fire. The trees fell from accumulated damage. Military historians consider the bloody angle one of the most sustained, close-quarters engagements in modern warfare. By morning, both sides had spent themselves. The log wall remained. The trees did not. 42. Chailloux, the president who wasn't on the ballot. Abraham Lincoln won the presidency in November of 1860, but the map of that election looks like almost nothing in American political history before or since. 10 southern states refused to place Lincoln's name on their ballots at all. Voters in those states simply had no option to choose him, and yet Lincoln won. He carried enough northern states to secure a majority in the Electoral College without receiving a single southern electoral vote, and with less than 40% of the national popular vote. Here's the thing about what that result communicated to southern political leaders. It told them loudly that the North had enough population and enough electoral weight to elect a president entirely without them. The feeling that the South had become structurally outvoted within the federal system was one of the driving forces behind the secession movement that followed. Lincoln's victory didn't cause the war, but the arithmetic of it convinced many that the war was coming regardless. 43. The medal she never gave back. Dr. Mary Edwards Walker spent the Civil War doing something the Army had no official category for, serving as a surgeon near the front lines, treating wounded soldiers under conditions that were dangerous and logistically chaotic. She was captured by Confederate forces in 1864, held as a prisoner of war, and eventually exchanged for a Confederate officer. One of the few times a woman was treated as a military equal in that particular grim transaction. She received the Medal of Honor in 1865. Here's the thing that happened in 1917. Congress conducted a review of Medal of Honor recipients and revoked hundreds of medals on technical eligibility grounds. Walker's was among them. She was asked to return it. She refused. She wore it every single day for the remaining 2 years of her life, until her death in 1919. Congress restored her medal posthumously in 1977. She remains the only woman ever to receive it. 44. When the bells went silent. By the final years of the war, the Confederacy was running critically short of metal, the raw material that cannons, ammunition, and rail infrastructure all required. Foundries that had once processed raw iron were stretched well beyond their capacity. Here's the thing about where some of the material eventually came from. Church bells. Throughout the South, bells were melted down and contributed to the Confederate war effort. Some communities offered their bells willingly as an act of wartime sacrifice. Others had them taken through impressment, a formal Confederate policy allowing military officials to seize private property in exchange for certificates of compensation. The sound of a church bell on a Sunday morning was, in some southern towns, simply gone by 1864. Melted. reformed into something the war needed more than the congregation did. There's something quietly striking about that exchange. The instrument made to call people together, remade into something designed to keep them apart. 45. The woman with the apartment full of supplies. Clara Barton was working as a clerk at the U.S. Patent Office in Washington when the war began. She watched wounded soldiers arrive in the capital with almost nothing to support them. Inadequate bandages, insufficient food, no organized system of care. She decided to fix it herself, without waiting for anyone to authorize her. She placed advertisements in Massachusetts newspapers asking for donations of supplies, stored everything she received in her apartment, and personally transported those supplies to field hospitals and battlefields. Here's the thing about her authorization to do any of this. She had none, at least not initially. The Army had no formal mechanism for what she was doing. She did it anyway, showing up near active combat zones with wagons loaded with what the official system had failed to provide. She was eventually granted permission to work near the front. In 1881, she founded the American Red Cross. It started, practically speaking, with an apartment and a classified ad. 46. The regiment and the mass grave. The 54th Massachusetts Infantry was among the first major black regiments raised in the North, and its story contains some of the war's most telling contradictions. On July the 18th, 1863, Colonel Robert Gould Shaw led approximately 600 men of the 54th in a frontal assault on Fort Wagner, a Confederate fortification on the South Carolina coast. Shaw and around 272 of his men were killed. Confederate commanders buried Shaw in a mass grave alongside his soldiers, a gesture intended to humiliate Shaw on the assumption that being buried with black soldiers was degrading to a white officer. Here's the thing about how Shaw's family responded when informed. They declined to have his body moved. His father wrote that he could not conceive of a better burial place or better company. The grave remained. The regiment's service helped shift public opinion in the North toward support for black military service in a way that no speech or editorial quite managed. 47. The famous document that changed nothing. Immediately, on January 1st, 1863, Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, and the date has been marked as a turning point ever since. Here's the thing about what the proclamation actually did on that specific day. Essentially nothing in practical terms. The document declared enslaved people in Confederate states to be free, but the Confederate states were not under Union authority. The proclamation explicitly did not apply to the 4 slaveholding states that had remained in the Union: Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware. No enslaved person was freed by the document's signature alone. Freedom, as the proclamation defined it, followed Union armies as they physically advanced into Confederate territory. The proclamation was a war measure and a political statement, both at once. It transformed the stated meaning of the war in ways that mattered enormously. It just didn't do so in the way the simple version of the story sometimes suggests. The gap between the document and its effect is where a great deal of the real history lives. 48. Coffee for tobacco, then back to the trenches along the Rappahannock River in Virginia. In the pauses between major engagements, something quietly human kept happening. Confederate soldiers had access to tobacco grown throughout the South. Some Union soldiers had coffee, supplied through a northern industrial network the Confederacy couldn't match. Both sides wanted what the other had, so they traded. Soldiers would call out across the river, negotiate informal terms, float small rafts or boats with their goods, and exchange them without anyone firing a shot. It happened at Fredericksburg. It happened at other river crossings throughout the war. Officers on both sides officially prohibited it. And here's the thing. It kept happening anyway. The men doing the trading would, when the next engagement came, take their positions and resume the business of the war. The same soldiers who had exchanged coffee and tobacco in the morning might be shooting at each other by afternoon. History tends to record the battles. The trades happen too, and they say something worth remembering about the people involved. 49. 16,000 men and a borrowed fort. When Confederate batteries opened fire on Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor on April 12, 1861, the United States Army had approximately 16,000 soldiers spread across a continent, most of them stationed along the western frontier, managing relationships with Native American nations across thousands of miles of territory. The garrison inside Fort Sumter numbered fewer than 100 men. Lincoln's response to the attack was to call for 75,000 volunteers. Here's the thing about what that call revealed. The entire regular U.S. Army could have fit inside a modest-sized modern sports stadium with room to spare. The Confederacy calculated, not unreasonably, that the Union lacked the military infrastructure to mount a serious response to secession. They were right about the infrastructure. They were wrong about the response. Within a year, the Union had built one of the largest armies in the world from an almost standing start. The 75,000 volunteers Lincoln called for were just the beginning of a much longer list. 50. The gun that arrived too early. Richard Gatling was a North Carolina-born inventor who, in 1861, completed a design for a hand-cranked multi-barrel firearm capable of firing several hundred rounds per minute, far beyond anything existing infantry weapons could achieve, and he offered it to the Union Army. The Army was skeptical. Here's the thing about institutional skepticism and new technology. It is sometimes reasonable and sometimes very costly. The Gatling gun was tested, reviewed, and ultimately adopted in very limited numbers. It saw use in a handful of engagements, but was never deployed at the scale that might have altered battlefield dynamics. The reasons were partly practical: supply, logistics, reliability concerns, and partly simply a matter of military culture not yet adapted to what the weapon represented. Gatling patented his design and continued improving it. The gun was formally adopted by the U.S. Army in 1866, after the war had ended. The weapon that might have shortened the conflict arrived, was considered carefully, and was mostly set aside until it was no longer needed. Half of the journey is behind you now. 50 chapters of history, quietly collected. If you're still awake enough to notice this, you've done well. And if you're drifting a little, that's even better. Settle in. There are 51 more, and they'll be waiting right here whenever your eyes are ready. 51. The name on every coat. Before the battle. Before the Battle of Antietam, before Gettysburg, before dozens of other major engagements, soldiers on both sides did something small and quietly significant. They wrote their names on scraps of paper, sometimes their home addresses too, and pinned them to the inside of their coats. There were no official identification tags in the Civil War. If a soldier died and couldn't be identified by a companion, he might be buried as unknown. Here's the thing about the private industry that grew up around this fear. Vendors near military camps sold small stamped metal identification pins, unofficial precursors to the dog tag, to soldiers who wanted some assurance that someone would know their name. The practice was widespread enough that historians have documented it extensively. Some of the handwritten notes survived in archives, found among effects collected after battles. The dog tag that every modern soldier carries traces its lineage directly to these pinned scraps of paper, a small personal answer to an unbearable question. If this story is settling over you like a warm blanket, you're exactly where you should be. Go ahead and subscribe if you haven't yet. There's a lot more history waiting for nights just like this one. 52. The surgeons who weren't butchers. Civil War surgeons earned a harsh nickname, butchers, because of how often they amputated limbs. The image that attached itself to field hospitals was of overwhelmed doctors making brutal decisions too quickly. Here's the thing about the actual medical reasoning. It was sound, and given what was known at the time. Infection was the primary killer of wounded soldiers. A limb with a shattered bone in an era before antibiotics had an extremely high probability of developing fatal infection if left. Removing it quickly gave the patient the best available chance. Survival rates for amputations were higher than the nickname suggests, approximately 75% for arms, around 50% for legs amputated above the knee. Those numbers were better than the survival rate for comparable wounds left untreated. Civil War surgeons worked under impossible conditions with limited tools, and the judgment history initially passed on them has softened considerably as medical historians have examined the evidence more carefully. 53. The doctor who organized chaos. Before Jonathan Letterman arrived as medical director of the Army of the Potomac in 1862, the Union Army's approach to caring for its wounded in the field was, charitably described, improvised. Wounded men could lie on battlefields for days. Ambulances were driven by untrained civilians who sometimes fled during fighting. There was no system for sorting patients by severity of injury. Letterman changed all of it. He created the first organized ambulance corps with trained drivers and a chain of command. So, he developed a formal triage system that prioritized patients based on the urgency of their need. Here's the thing about where his work eventually led. Every modern emergency medical system, military and civilian, traces its principles back to what Letterman built in the middle of the Civil War. The paramedic who arrives when you call for help is, in a direct institutional sense, practicing something that started in a Virginia field in 1862. 54. The name they gave to something real Union Army physicians noticed a pattern in soldiers returning from sustained combat. The men had racing pulses, persistent anxiety, difficulty sleeping, and a profound inability to re-engage with ordinary life. The condition didn't fit neatly into any existing medical category. Doctors called it soldier's heart, or sometimes nostalgia, reaching for a word that acknowledged something had changed in these men without being able to fully define what. Here's the thing about how it was treated. Options were limited. Rest, reassignment, discharge, and in some cases, simply sending men home were the primary responses. The underlying condition wasn't formally recognized as a psychiatric disorder until decades after the Vietnam War, when it was classified as post-traumatic stress disorder in 1980. The name changed. The treatments improved substantially. But the experience the Civil War doctors were observing and struggling to name, that particular weight carried home from combat, was entirely real, and the men who carried it knew it, even when the medicine didn't. 55. The 400 who kept their secret. At least 400 women disguised themselves as men and served in the Civil War. And historians generally agree that number is probably much lower than the truth. The documented cases are the ones where the disguise was discovered, usually through injury, illness, or death. Most women who served this way and survived simply went home when the war ended, resumed their lives, and told no one. Here's the thing about how discovery typically happened. A soldier wounded in battle might be identified as a woman during medical treatment. A soldier who died might be identified in the same way. Some gave birth while in camp, which ended the disguise abruptly. A small number were discovered through routine inspection. Most were quietly discharged without formal charges. The actual number of women who served without ever being discovered is, by definition, impossible to know. They're not in the records because the records never caught up with them. Their service happened. It just happened invisibly, which was the entire point. 56. The president who once poured drinks, professionally. Before Abraham Lincoln was a lawyer, before he was a state legislator, and long before anyone thought of him as presidential material, he co-owned a general store and tavern in New Salem, Illinois. The establishment was called Berry and Lincoln, named for his business partner William Berry. It was licensed to sell liquor, and Lincoln served as one of the proprietors. Here's the thing about how the venture ended. It failed. Barry had a habit of drinking what the store was supposed to sell, and the finances collapsed. So, Lincoln referred to the resulting debt as the national debt, a phrase that carried more irony than he probably intended given where his life was heading. He spent years paying it off, methodically, out of his earnings as a lawyer. The image of Lincoln as a self-made man climbing steadily upward is accurate in the large arc, but the tavern chapter is a reminder that the climb included some significant stumbles along the way. 57. 4 years that built a government. The United States entered the Civil War in 1861 with a relatively limited federal government. No national currency, no income tax, no military draft, no organized federal intelligence service, and no formal system of federal paper currency. By 1865, all of those things existed. Here's the thing about the pace of that transformation. It happened in 4 years, under the pressure of a war that demanded institutional answers to problems the existing framework had no mechanism to address. The income tax, the draft, the greenback, the Secret Service, and the Bureau of Military Information all emerged from that same compressed window. Political scientists and historians sometimes describe the Civil War as the moment when the United States government became recognizably modern, when federal authority expanded in ways that permanently altered the relationship between Washington and the rest of the country. The government that emerged from 1865 was structurally different from the one that entered 1861 in ways that have never fully reversed. 58. The general who taught himself, Nathan Bedford Forrest, enlisted in the Confederate Army in 1861 as a private. He had no formal military training, no West Point education, and no prior commissioned service. He had made his living before the war as a businessman and slave trader in Memphis, Tennessee. Here's the thing about what happened next. Forrest rose to the rank of lieutenant general, making him the only person on either side of the conflict to begin the war as a private and reach that rank. Military historians have studied his cavalry tactics for generations, particularly his instinct for speed, deception, and striking at supply lines rather than engaging in direct confrontation when avoidable. His wartime record is taught in military academies for its tactical ingenuity. His post-war history, including his role in founding the Ku Klux Klan, is documented and examined as part of the full accounting of who he was. Both parts of his story exist, and both are part of the historical record. 59. What the cornerstone speech actually said. When Confederate Vice President Alexander Stephens delivered a speech in Savannah, Georgia, in March of 1861, he addressed directly the question of what the Confederacy stood for and why it differed from the United States. He described slavery as the cornerstone of the Confederate government. He stated explicitly that the Confederacy's foundations were built on truths that the Founding Fathers had considered wrong, but which Confederate leaders believed were correct. Here's the thing about why this speech matters historically. It removes ambiguity from debates about Confederate motivation that sometimes arise in discussions of the war's causes. Stephens was the second highest official in the Confederate government, speaking publicly in the Confederacy's first weeks of existence about what it was founded to preserve. The speech was transcribed and published at the time. It is a primary source document available to anyone who looks for it. The historical record on this point is not particularly complicated. Stephens made his government's position clear, in his own words, in March of 1861. 60. The first draft, that included compensation. Before the Emancipation Proclamation reached its final form, Abraham Lincoln spent considerable time exploring a different approach. His early proposals for ending slavery included gradual emancipation, paired with financial compensation to slave owners, including those in the border states that had remained in the Union. Lincoln argued that compensating owners and ending slavery slowly over decades would ultimately cost less, in total, than continuing the war. He He presented versions of this plan to border state representatives in Congress multiple times. Here's the thing. They rejected it each time. Border state politicians were not interested in the arrangement for a complicated mix of political, economic, and ideological reasons. The compensated emancipation approach was eventually abandoned. Troy and the final Emancipation Proclamation that Lincoln issued contained no compensation provision and applied only to Confederate states. What Lincoln originally envisioned and what he ultimately signed were quite different documents, shaped by the limits of what Congress and the border states would accept. 61. The professor who held the line. Before the war, Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain taught rhetoric and modern languages at Bowdoin College in Maine. He had no military training. He taught himself tactics largely from books while serving in the field. On July 2, 1863, his regiment, the 20th Maine, was positioned at the far left of the entire Union line at Little Round Top, Gettysburg. If that flank collapsed, Confederate forces could sweep behind the Union Army. Chamberlain's men ran out of ammunition during repeated Confederate assaults. Here's the thing about what he ordered next: a downhill bayonet charge, which was unexpected enough to work. The Confederate assault broke. The flank held. Chamberlain received the Medal of Honor for that afternoon. 2 years later, Grant chose him to formally receive the Confederate infantry's surrender at Appomattox. The rhetoric professor from Maine had come a considerable distance from the classroom. 62. The supplies that were already gone, by early April of 1865, Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia was retreating west through Virginia, trying to stay ahead of Grant's pursuing forces. The plan was to reach Appomattox Station, where supply trains were waiting. Food, ammunition, the necessities of continued resistance. Here's the thing about what Lee's men found when they arrived. Union cavalry had gotten there first. The supplies were gone. The army was surrounded, exhausted, and without provisions. Lee called a council of war. His officers assessed the situation honestly. The numbers, the geography, the empty supply depot, everything pointed the same direction. Lee surrendered to Grant the following morning at a private home belonging to the McLean family. The war in the East ended not with a dramatic last stand, but with hungry men, a missing supply train, and a general who understood what the mathematics of the situation meant. 63, 4 words that outlasted the war. In October of 1864, Union forces at Allatoona Pass, Georgia, were under serious pressure from Confederate troops attempting to retake a mountain garrison the Union held. General William Sherman, positioned miles away, sent a signal message by flag relay across the distance between them. The message, as recorded, read, "Hold the fort, for I am coming." The troops held. Sherman's forces arrived. The position was secured. Here's the thing about what happened to those 4 words afterward. They escaped the battle entirely and walked into everyday English. Preachers used the phrase in sermons. Songwriters put it in hymns. Eventually, it shed its military meaning completely, becoming a casual way of asking someone to wait, to stay, to maintain whatever they're currently doing. The phrase is still in use today, most often by people who have no idea it began as a literal military order sent by a signal flag across a Georgia mountain. 64. The speech Lincoln wrote and waited to use. In the summer of 1862, Abraham Lincoln drafted the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation and brought it to his cabinet. Secretary of State William Seward listened carefully and offered a specific piece of advice. Don't release it yet. After a string of Union military setbacks, Seward argued, the proclamation would read as an act of desperation, a government reaching for a dramatic gesture because it had run out of military options. Lincoln accepted the reasoning and put the document in a drawer. Here's the thing about what he was waiting for: a Union victory. Antietam in September of 1862 provided something close enough. It was technically a tactical draw, but Lee's army withdrew from Maryland. 5 days later, Lincoln issued the preliminary proclamation. The timing wasn't accidental and wasn't purely about military momentum. It was a calculated decision about how a document would be received, depending on the news surrounding it. 65. The song Nobody Claimed at First Dixie was written in 1859 by Daniel Decatur Emmett, a songwriter and performer from Mount Vernon, Ohio, well north of the Mason-Dixon line. It was a minstrel song written for Northern entertainment, and it became popular in Northern theaters before the war began. Here's the thing about how it became the Confederacy's anthem, almost by accident. The song was played at Jefferson Davis's inauguration in Montgomery, Alabama, in February of 1861, partly because it was familiar and upbeat. It caught on. By the time anyone gave the origin much thought, it had already become synonymous with Southern identity. Lincoln was reportedly delighted by this irony. On the day Lee surrendered, he asked a band at the White House to play it, remarking that the Union had fairly captured the tune. An Ohio man's Northern entertainment song outlasted the Confederacy that adopted it. 66. Show, the government that paid for new limbs. The Civil War produced more than 60,000 amputees, a number that had no precedent in American history, and that the existing medical and social systems had no framework to address. In 1862, Congress passed legislation establishing a program to provide free artificial limbs to Union veterans who had lost them in service. So, here's the thing about why this was significant beyond the immediate humanitarian purpose. It was the first major government-funded prosthetics program in American history. It created financial incentives for manufacturers to develop better, lighter, more functional artificial limbs. The industry that emerged from that wartime investment formed the foundation of modern American prosthetics manufacturing. Veterans could choose from a small approved list of devices. Some manufacturers competed aggressively for government contracts by improving their designs. The program was practical policy that happened to advance medical technology, driven by the scale of loss the war had produced. 67. The buried weapon nobody had a name for. Yet General Gabriel Rains was a Confederate officer who early in the war began deploying explosive devices buried along roads and approaches, triggered by pressure, hidden from view, designed to detonate when enemy forces passed over them. Union commanders were genuinely outraged. They argued the devices were contrary to accepted rules of war because they targeted soldiers who had no warning and no opportunity to respond. Rains disagreed, arguing they were legitimate defensive weapons. Here's the thing about where his invention eventually led. The pressure-activated buried explosive he developed became the template for what military history now calls the landmine. It was controversial in 1862. It remains controversial today. The modern international debates about landmine use and the treaties designed to limit them trace their origins to the same basic moral question that Union commanders raised when they first encountered Gabriel Rains's buried shells along Virginia roads. 68. The Amendment and the missing paperwork. The 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, formally abolishing slavery, was ratified in December of 1865. Mississippi's state legislature voted to ratify it in 1865 as well, and then did not officially file the paperwork with the federal government, apparently through an administrative oversight that went unnoticed for over a century. Here's the thing about how this was discovered. A Mississippi resident researching the history of the amendment after watching the film Lincoln in 2012 found that Mississippi's ratification had never been formally recorded with the Office of the Federal Register. The state submitted the paperwork to correct the record in February of 2013, 148 years after the amendment passed. The oversight had no practical legal effect, since the amendment had been ratified by the required number of other states. But the paperwork gap meant that Mississippi's formal ratification was, technically filed in the 21st century. 69. 1 in 10. In 1860, the United States had a population of approximately 31 million people. Over the course of the Civil War, more than 3 million men served in the Union and Confederate armies combined. Here's the thing about what that ratio means. Roughly 1 in every 10 Americans served in uniform during the war. In some northern and southern states, the proportion was considerably higher among men of military age. Communities lost not a few of their young men, but most of them for years. Farms went untended, businesses closed, families reorganized themselves around absence. The scale of that mobilization was unlike anything the country had experienced, and wasn't matched again until the Second World War. 3 million is a number large enough to be abstract. The more useful way to hold it is this. In most American towns of that era, nearly every family had someone in the war. It was not distant. It was everywhere. 70. The battle plans wrapped around cigars. On September 13, 1862, Cho, a Union soldier in a recently abandoned Confederate campsite near Frederick, Maryland, found a bundle lying in the grass. Inside it were 3 cigars wrapped in paper. The paper, when examined, turned out to be a copy of Robert E. Lee's Special Orders Number 191, his complete operational plan for the Maryland campaign, detailing the positions and movements of every Confederate force in the state. Union General George McClellan received the document within hours. He described it as a rare stroke of luck. Here's the thing about what happened next. McClellan waited approximately 18 hours before acting on the intelligence. The delay gave Lee time to learn his plans had been compromised and begin adjusting his dispositions. The subsequent battle was Antietam. What the loss order ultimately produced was the bloodiest single day in American military history, rather than the decisive Union victory the intelligence might have enabled. 70 chapters now. The night has gotten quieter around you, hasn't it? If your thoughts are moving more slowly, if the words are washing over you more than through you, that's the whole idea. Rest easy. The history is still here, still moving gently forward. So are you. 71. Intelligence inside the Confederate household. Jefferson Davis and his family lived in the Confederate Executive Mansion in Richmond, Virginia, for most of the war. The household required staff, and among those working there was a woman named Mary Bowser, a freed black woman who had been educated in the North. Here's the thing about how she came to be there. Elizabeth Van Lew, the Union spy operating in Richmond, arranged for Bowser to be placed in the Davis household as a domestic worker. Bowser reportedly had an exceptional memory and was able to pass information about what she observed, documents, conversations, visitors, back through Van Lew's network to Union intelligence. The full extent of Bowser's contribution is difficult to document precisely, since intelligence operations are not designed to leave thorough records. What is documented is her placement and her connection to Van Lew's network. Her role was recognized formally by the U.S. Army Intelligence Hall of Fame in 1995. 72. 50,000 children. Both the Union and Confederate armies had official minimum age requirements for enlisted service. Both also had an enormous number of soldiers who were younger than those requirements allowed. Estimates suggest that approximately 50,000 soldiers who served in the Civil War were under the age of 18, some as young as 12. Recruiters frequently looked past obvious youth when enlistment numbers needed filling. Boys lied about their age with some regularity. Some enlisted with the written consent of a parent. Here's the thing about the roles they filled. While many younger soldiers served as drummers or in support capacities, documented cases exist of underage soldiers in direct combat roles. The youngest confirmed combatant in the war was 12 years old. These were children navigating an adult catastrophe with whatever resources they had. The records that survive from their service are often fragmentary because the systems that created those records weren't designed with them in mind. 73. The word that lost its worst meaning. Inside Andersonville Prison in Georgia, a wooden rail was set 19 feet from the interior stockade wall. The rule governing it was simple and absolute. Any prisoner who crossed that rail would be shot by the guards positioned above. No warning, no exception. The boundary was called the deadline. Here's the thing about language and how it travels. The phrase deadline moved out of the prison camp context and into general American usage during and after the war, initially still carrying serious weight. Over the following decades, it softened. By the early 20th century, newspapers were using it to describe the latest time a story could be submitted for publication. The urgency remained, the lethality evaporated. Today, the word deadline appears on calendars and in emails millions of times a day with no connection to its origin. Some words carry their histories quietly, tucked entirely out of sight. 74, 2 days that surpassed 7 years. The Battle of Shiloh lasted 2 days, April 6th and 7th, 1862, across the fields and ravines of southwestern Tennessee, near a small log church called Shiloh Meeting House. When the fighting ended, 23,746 Americans had been killed, wounded, or gone missing. Here's the thing that puts those 2 days into proportion. The entire Revolutionary War, fought over 7 years across multiple colonies and states, produced an estimated 25,000 military deaths. Shiloh came within 1,300 casualties of matching 7 years of the founding conflict in 48 hours. Grant later wrote that after Shiloh, he gave up any hope the war would end quickly or quietly. The men who survived it said the same thing in their letters home. The word Shiloh means place of peace in Hebrew. The battle fought, there was the moment both sides stopped expecting one. 75. The night train to Washington. In February of 1861, Abraham Lincoln was traveling by train from Springfield, Illinois, to Washington for his inauguration. So, Allan Pinkerton and his detectives had uncovered what they believed was a credible plot to intercept and harm Lincoln when his train passed through Baltimore, Maryland. Here's the thing about how Lincoln responded. He quietly rerouted. Traveling ahead of his announced schedule, in a different train car passing through Baltimore in the middle of the night, he arrived in Washington in the early morning hours of February 23rd without incident. The press discovered the change and mocked it thoroughly, publishing cartoons that depicted Lincoln sneaking into the Capitol in disguise. Lincoln was embarrassed by the coverage and later said he regretted allowing the secretive routing. The threat, however, was real enough that his security team had taken it seriously. 4 years later, at Ford's Theater, a different threat arrived without any advance warning at all. 76. A currency worth less than the paper. It was printed on the Confederate government financed its war effort largely by printing money. Paper currency issued without adequate gold or silver reserves to back it. Early in the war, Confederate dollars circulated at a reasonable exchange rate. As the war continued and Confederate military fortunes declined, confidence in the currency collapsed. By 1865, a Confederate dollar was worth less than 2 cents in gold. Here's the thing about what that meant for ordinary families in the South. Starvation and hardship were not primarily caused by a lack of food in the region, but by the inability to purchase it. The money they held bought almost nothing. Confederate notes eventually became keepsakes, collected as reminders of the war. Some were used as fuel for fires. The currency of a government is, in its simplest form, a bet on that government's future. By 1865, almost nobody was taking that bet anymore. 77. The general lost at Antietam. The Battle of Antietam on September 17, 1862, produced command-level casualties on both sides. Among the Union losses was General Israel Richardson, one of the more capable division commanders in the Army of the Potomac. Richardson was struck by artillery fire while observing the battle from an exposed position and died of his wound 6 weeks later in November of 1862. Here's the thing about his loss in the broader context of Antietam. The battle was followed by a period of Union inaction that frustrated Lincoln and eventually led to McClellan's removal from command. The Army of the Potomac had an opportunity in the days after Antietam to press the retreating Confederate forces more aggressively, and it did not. Historians who have studied the aftermath note that the loss of experienced commanders like Richardson contributed to the Army's diminished capacity for immediate follow-up action. Individual losses at the command level carried strategic weight. 78. How close Europe came to intervening. By the autumn of 1862, the diplomatic situation was genuinely uncertain. British Prime Minister Lord Palmerston and Foreign Secretary Lord Russell were in active correspondence about the possibility of formally recognizing the Confederacy as an independent nation. Recognition would have given the Confederacy access to international credit, legitimized its diplomacy, and potentially opened European ports to Confederate trade. Here's the thing that interrupted those conversations. Two things, arriving almost simultaneously. The Battle of Antietam demonstrated that the Confederacy had not delivered the decisive victory on Northern soil that might have justified recognition, and Lincoln's preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, issued 5 days after the battle, framed the war explicitly as a conflict over slavery. For Britain, which had abolished slavery decades earlier, formally aligning with the Confederacy after that proclamation carried a political cost that Palmerston ultimately decided was too high. European intervention ended without ever quite beginning. 79. The photographs nobody could return. Photography was still young during the Civil War. Daguerreotypes and paper prints were precious objects, not easily reproduced or replaced. For a soldier far from home, a photograph of family was one of the most valued things he carried. Here's the thing that happens sometimes during informal truces and ceasefires along rivers and picket lines. Soldiers on opposite sides exchanged family photographs. A Union soldier might trade a portrait of his wife and children for one a Confederate soldier carried of his. These exchanges were documented in letters and diaries from the period. Some of the photographs still exist in historical archives, separated long ago from any identifying information. Nobody knows whose families they show. The faces in them are real people who sent their fathers and husbands and sons to war, and whose images ended up in the hands of someone on the other side, kept with some care, because it was still someone's family after all. 80. What the war actually cost. The direct financial cost of the Civil War to the United States government, North and South combined, was approximately $6.2 billion in 1860-era currency. When historians factor in veterans' pensions, long-term disability payments, and infrastructure losses, the total figure climbs considerably higher, past $10 billion in period dollars. Here's the thing about the southern portion of that accounting. The economic consequences in the former Confederate states extended far beyond the war years. Agricultural infrastructure, rail networks, and accumulated capital had been substantially destroyed or disrupted. In some southern counties, per capita wealth measured in real terms never returned to pre-war levels within the 19th century. The war's financial cost to the federal government was eventually paid. The regional economic consequences took a different kind of accounting, measured not in treasury records but in decades of slower recovery in communities that had borne the physical weight of the fighting. 81. The language of the soldiers' experience veterans returning from combat in the Civil War used a particular phrase to describe what it had been like to face battle for the first time. They said they had gone to see the elephant. The origin of the expression is somewhat debated, but its meaning was widely understood. It described the gap between imagining something enormous and actually standing in front of it. Here's the thing about how the phrase circulated. It traveled through letters, diaries, and campfire conversations until it became standard shorthand across both armies. Men who hadn't yet been in combat were said not to have seen the elephant. Those who had carried the phrase as a kind of quiet credential. After the war, the expression faded from common use. It belongs almost entirely to the men who needed it, which is perhaps the right kind of word. One that meant exactly what it needed to mean, for exactly as long as it was needed. 82. The army that had everything and the army that didn't. By the middle years of the war, the material difference between the two armies had become difficult to ignore. Union soldiers were generally well supplied with food, ammunition, footwear, and equipment, backed by Northern factories running at full industrial capacity. Confederate soldiers increasingly went without. Shoes were a persistent problem. Blankets were scarce. Food rations were reduced repeatedly as supply lines were disrupted. Here's the thing about what that imbalance meant in human terms. Men fought in bare feet across rocky ground in winter. They marched on roads that tore through unprotected skin. They ate what they could forage when official rations ran short. The Confederacy's generals were often tactically brilliant. What they could not overcome ultimately was arithmetic, the slow, grinding math of industrial capacity applied steadily over 4 years against a side that was running out of everything at once. 83. The war that rode the rails. Before the Civil War, moving a large army from one place to another meant marching. Days, sometimes weeks, of men and horses covering ground slowly. The Civil War changed that. Both sides used railroad networks to shift troops and supplies at speeds that fundamentally altered military strategy. Here's the thing that illustrates the scale of that change most clearly. In September of 1863, the Confederacy transferred approximately 12,000 soldiers from Virginia all the way to Georgia by rail in roughly 8 days. On foot, that journey would have taken weeks and arrived the men exhausted. By train, they arrived ready to fight. Control of rail junctions and lines became a primary military objective throughout the war. Sherman's campaign through Georgia was partly a campaign against Confederate rail infrastructure. The lesson the Civil War taught about railroads and military logistics shaped how every major army in the world planned for war in the decades that followed. 84. The ones who left and came back. Under different names. Desertion was a genuine challenge for both armies throughout the war. Estimates suggest approximately 200,000 Union soldiers deserted at some point during the conflict, along with roughly 100,000 Confederates. Most were never formally prosecuted. Here's the thing about a particular pattern that emerged. Some soldiers deserted, traveled to a different district or state, and re-enlisted under a different name, collecting a signing bonus in the process. This happened often enough that it became a recognized problem for military administrators. The Union executed 141 men for desertion over the course of the war, a number that, measured against the estimated total, suggests most deserters faced no formal consequences at all. The reasons men left were as varied as the men themselves: exhaustion, family crisis, fear, illness. The war was long, and 4 years is a long time to hold any line. 85. The town that carried the weight. After 3 days of fighting in early July of 1863, the town of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, was left holding something it had no preparation for. Supper. The pre-war population was approximately 2,400 people. The battle left behind roughly 22,000 wounded soldiers who needed care, plus thousands of horses and the physical aftermath of the largest engagement ever fought on American soil. Here's the thing about the smell. Witnesses recorded that it was detectable from miles away for weeks in the July heat. Civilians organized themselves to help with burial and care under conditions that had no precedent in their experience. The formal cemetery on the grounds wasn't dedicated until November, 4 months after the battle. Gettysburg residents lived inside the aftermath of that July for the rest of that year, and in many ways, for the rest of their lives. Some towns become part of history whether they choose to or not. 86. The leader caught between his own principles. Jefferson Davis spent the war in a structural tension that had no clean resolution. The Confederacy was founded on the principle of strong states' rights, the idea that individual states held ultimate authority over their own affairs. But fighting a modern industrial war against the Union required exactly the kind of centralized federal coordination that the Confederacy's founding philosophy opposed. Here's the thing about how that played out practically. Confederate governors frequently refused to send troops or supplies across state lines, prioritizing their own state's defense over coordinated Confederate strategy. Davis clashed repeatedly with governors and generals about authority and resources. He could not build the national war machine the situation required without dismantling the argument the Confederacy claimed to be fighting for. It was a contradiction built into the foundation, and it followed the Confederate government from its first days to its last. 87. The factories that built the next century. When the war ended in 1865, the North's industrial infrastructure didn't stop. The factories that had spent 4 years producing rifles, artillery, uniforms, canned food, and railroad equipment retooled and kept running, now aimed at a civilian economy expanding rapidly westward. Here's the thing about the scale of what that produced. The economic explosion of the 1870s through 1900s, the period historians call the Gilded Age, was built substantially on the industrial foundation laid during the Civil War. Steel production, railroad networks, food preservation, and manufacturing capacity had all been expanded and refined under wartime pressure. The war accelerated American industrialization by an estimated several decades. The country that emerged from the conflict in 1865 was materially different from the one that entered it in 1861, not just politically, but in what it was capable of making. 88. The hill that wasn't taken. On the evening of July 1st, 1863, Confederate General Richard Ewell's forces had driven Union troops back through the streets of Gettysburg after a day of successful fighting. At Cemetery Hill and Culp's Hill, elevated positions south of town, were still lightly defended. Robert E. Lee sent Ewell a discretionary order to take those heights if he found it practicable. Here's the thing about the word practicable. Ewell assessed the situation and decided it wasn't. He did not advance. That night, Union forces moved onto the heights and dug in. The following 2 days of the battle were spent in uphill assaults against those fortified positions. Many historians have examined Ewell's decision carefully, weighing the genuine tactical uncertainties he faced against the consequences of inaction. The debate has never fully settled. What is clear is that by the morning of July 2nd, the ground had changed completely. 89. The slow squeeze. When Lincoln declared a naval blockade of Confederate ports in April of 1861, the initial reaction from some observers was skepticism. The U.S. Navy didn't have enough ships to effectively patrol thousands of miles of southern coastline immediately. Blockade runners, fast, shallow draft vessels, slipped through regularly in the early years. Here's the thing about how the blockade worked over time. It tightened. Every year, more Union ships were added. Blockade running became progressively more dangerous and less profitable. By 1864, the Confederacy was importing less than a third of what it had before the war. Coffee, medicine, manufactured goods, and war materials that could only come from abroad became increasingly scarce. The blockade didn't win the war by itself, but it methodically removed the Confederacy's ability to replace what the fighting consumed until the shortages became part of the fighting itself. 90. The rail line that would not bend back. As William Sherman's army moved through Georgia and then the Carolinas, his soldiers developed a systematic method for destroying Confederate railroad infrastructure. They tore up rails, built large fires with the wooden ties, heated the rails until they were pliable, and then bent them around nearby trees in long curves. Here's the thing about why that last step mattered. A straight rail can be reused. A rail twisted around a tree cannot be straightened without a steel mill. And the Confederacy had very few functioning steel mills by 1864. The soldiers called the results Sherman's neckties, or sometimes Jeff Davis bow ties. The twisted rails they left behind weren't just dramatic. They were permanent for all practical wartime purposes. The Confederate supply and communication network depended on those rail lines. When the rails became neckties, that network came apart, and the army at the end of it had no way to hold itself together. Divinies descimt permas, the ship that wouldn't stop. The CSS Shenandoah was a Confederate commerce raider operating in the Pacific and Arctic Oceans when Lee surrendered at Appomattox in April of 1865. Her captain, James Waddell, received reports of Confederate defeat, but initially doubted them and continued operations. Here's the thing about how long the Shenandoah kept going. She captured and destroyed Union whaling vessels in the Bering Sea well into June of 1865, months after the war had ended, because Waddell didn't accept the news as confirmed. In August, a British ship provided documentation, convincing enough that Waddell finally stood down. The Shenandoah sailed to Liverpool, England, and surrendered to British authorities on November 6, 1865, 7 months after Appomattox. She was the last Confederate military force to cease operations. The war ended at different times for different people, and for the crew of the Shenandoah, it ended in an English port far from home. 92. The rumor network with its own name. Information traveled in unpredictable ways during the Civil War. Official dispatches moved through formal military channels and took time. Unofficial news moved faster, through soldiers passing between units, through civilians near camps, through whispers that somehow crossed picket lines. Soldiers attributed this informal network to an imaginary telegraph line strung from grapevine, calling it the grapevine telegraph. Here's the thing about the phrase. It caught on immediately and traveled far beyond the camps where it was coined. Newspapers picked it up. Civilians used it. After the war, it settled into everyday American English as a way to describe hearing something through informal or unverified channels. The original meaning, a network of rumor operating faster than official communication, translated perfectly into peacetime life. People still say they heard something through the grapevine today, most of them entirely unaware that the phrase was coined by soldiers trying to figure out what was happening in a war they were living through. 93. Two Kentuckians, Abraham Lincoln was born on February 12, 1809, in a log cabin in Hardin County, Kentucky. Jefferson Davis was born on June 3, 1808, in Christian County, Kentucky, approximately 94 miles away. Two men born in the same state. Within a year and less than 100 miles of each other, grew up to lead opposing sides of the most destructive war in American history. Here's the thing that makes this feel like something more than coincidence. It isn't coincidence, exactly. Kentucky in the early 19th century was a place where American migration and social division crossed. Both men's families moved away in different directions, and both men built their lives in different worlds that the same country contained. They were neighbors by birth who became, by the war's final accounting, the clearest possible symbol of a nation, divided so deeply it fought itself. Same soil, completely different destinies. 94. The poet who showed up to help. Walt Whitman was living in New York when the Civil War began. When his brother was wounded at Fredericksburg in 1862, Whitman traveled south to find him and stayed. For the next several years, he spent most of his time in Washington military hospitals, sitting with wounded and dying soldiers, writing letters on their behalf, offering company to men who had none. Here's the thing about the scale of what he did. Whitman estimated he made around 600 hospital visits and assisted between 80,000 and 100,000 men over the course of the war. The experience changed him permanently and profoundly shaped his writing. His collection, Drum Taps, published in 1865, came directly from those hospital rooms. He also contracted an illness from his hospital work that affected his health for the rest of his life. He showed up to be useful. The war kept part of him when he finally left. 95. The victory that exhausted the victor, the Battle of Chickamauga in September of 1863, was one of the Confederate Army's most significant victories in the Western theater. Union forces under General William Rosecrans were pushed back heavily over 2 days of fighting, ultimately retreating to Chattanooga, Tennessee. The Confederate Army, commanded by General Braxton Bragg, held the field. Here's the thing about what that victory cost: 34,624 total casualties across both sides, with Confederate losses proportionally severe. Bragg's army had won the ground but lost too many men to pursue the retreating Union forces aggressively. The strategic advantage the victory might have produced was lost almost immediately. Confederate President Jefferson Davis and Bragg's own subordinate generals clashed bitterly over the missed opportunity. Chickamauga stands in Civil War history as a reminder that winning a battle and winning a campaign are two separate things, and sometimes the distance between them is measured in the men who didn't make it back. 95 chapters. You've traveled the whole length of this history tonight, almost to the end. If you're still here, even halfway, even just barely, you've done something worth doing. Let your eyes close the rest of the way. The last few chapters will carry you home. 96. The first veterans' homes. When the war ended, tens of thousands of Union veterans returned home with injuries, illness, and no formal system to support them. Congress responded in 1865 by establishing the National Home for Disabled Volunteer Soldiers, a network of federally funded residential facilities for veterans who could no longer fully support themselves. Here's the thing about the scale it eventually reached. At its peak, more than 150,000 veterans lived in those homes across multiple facilities nationwide. It was the largest federal social welfare program in American history up to that point. The system that grew from it became, over the following century, the Department of Veterans Affairs. Every VA hospital, every Veterans Service Center operating today, traces its institutional lineage back to the homes Congress established in 1865. The government that asked so much of those men tried, imperfectly and gradually, to build something that would take care of them afterward. 97. The initials that already fit in February of 1862, Union forces under Ulysses Grant captured Fort Donelson, Tennessee, a significant early victory that opened Confederate lines in the Western theater. When Confederate General Simon Bolivar Buckner asked what terms Grant would offer for surrender, Grant's reply was direct: no terms except unconditional and immediate surrender. Here's the thing that the Northern press noticed immediately. Grant's initials were U.S. The phrase unconditional surrender Grant wrote itself, and newspapers ran with it enthusiastically. Lincoln promoted Grant to Major General within days. Before Fort Donelson, Grant had been a relatively obscure commander with an uncertain military future. After it, he was a national figure. The nickname followed him for the rest of the war and into the presidency. Sometimes a person and a moment fit together so cleanly that the story almost tells itself. Grant's initials had been there all along, waiting for the right afternoon. 98. The plot. Before the plot, John Wilkes Booth's assassination of Abraham Lincoln in April of 1865 was not the first Confederate-linked plan targeting the president. In 1864, a Confederate intelligence agent named Thomas Conrad developed a detailed scheme to abduct Lincoln from his regular carriage route between the White House and the soldiers' home, where Lincoln often stayed during summer months. Here's the thing about why the plan was abandoned. Lincoln's security escort was increased around the same time Conrad was finalizing his preparations, making the abduction impractical. Conrad stood down. Booth's later plot, also initially conceived as an abduction, proceeded through a different timeline and a different set of circumstances. Lincoln had been a target for longer than most people realize. The evening at Ford's Theater was the one that history recorded, but the threat it represented had been accumulating quietly for years before that night in April. 99. The camera that changed everything. Matthew Brady, Alexander Gardner, and a small community of photographers documented the Civil War with a thoroughness that no previous conflict had experienced. They traveled with armies, set up mobile darkrooms, and recorded battlefields, encampments, officers, and ordinary soldiers in thousands of images. Here's the thing about the moment the public truly encountered what that meant. In October of 1862, Brady exhibited photographs of the dead at Antietam in his New York City gallery. Viewers stood in front of images of actual battlefield casualties, something most Americans had never seen. Newspaper accounts described the crowd's reaction as stunned and somber. The images didn't glorify the war or editorialize it. They simply showed it. White photography gave the Civil War a visual reality that previous conflicts had never had, and it permanently changed the relationship between war and the people at home who were trying to understand what it actually looked like. 100. The day that still holds the record. September 17th, 1862. The battle covered farmland, a sunken road, a stone bridge over a creek, and a sequence of cornfields in western Maryland. When darkness ended the fighting, the casualty count stood at 22,717 Americans, killed, wounded, or missing in a single day. Here's the thing about that number in time. It has never been exceeded. Not on any day of the First or Second World War. Not at any point in Korea or Vietnam or any subsequent conflict. The deadliest single day in American military history was September 17th, 1862, and it has remained so for over 160 years. The creek the battle is named for, Antietam, flows through that same landscape today, past the same stone bridge, through fields that are quiet now. The ground remembers what happened there, even when the calendar has moved a long way past it. 101. The last payment, Moses Triplett, was a Union veteran who had served in the Civil War and lived until 1938, long enough to see the automobile, commercial radio, and the beginning of the Second World War. His daughter, Irene Triplett, received a dependence pension from the U.S. government for being the child of a Civil War veteran. The monthly payment was $73.13. Here's the thing that makes this the quietest, most human ending to the whole story. Irene Triplett died on May 31st, 2020. The Civil War ended on April 9th, 1865. The United States made its final financial obligation connected to that war 155 years after it concluded. The last pension check was sent. A woman who had never seen the war, whose father had fought in it before she was born, was the final thread connecting the government to something that happened in another century. And then, gently, that thread came loose. So tonight, somewhere between the Confederate agents who set 19 hotels on fire and still couldn't burn New York down, and the submarine that made history and then disappeared for 131 years, and the soldier who carried a bullet from his own forehead in his pocket to reunions for decades. Somewhere in all of that is a reminder that history is less a series of grand decisions and more a long, strange accumulation of human moments. Clara Barton stored bandages in her apartment. Ulysses Grant kept a name that wasn't his. The last pension check for the Civil War was signed in 2020. The war never really ended on a single day. It just slowly, quietly ran out of people to pay. Sleep well. The history kept going long after everyone involved had gone to bed.